So the question that wakes me up in the morning and keeps me up at night is this, right? Whether it is indeed possible to meet these two big planetary objectives, right? Can we have a world without hunger? And can we have a world where we stabilize climate? And the reason these things are linked, of course, is that within our Earth system, climate and food security are actually very tightly coupled. So let's talk about what that means a little bit. I'll start over here in the lower left-hand corner. And let me pause for 1 second, and I'll say my research group here, we live in this space, like in this coupled system, thinking about the connections between climate and food security. And we really think about it parsed out in this way. So let me start out in the lower left-hand corner. The first sort of bucket of research that we're doing is thinking about really what are the emissions into our atmosphere from agriculture and associated land use change, right? So it turns out this is a little bit tricky. Unlike putting monitors in smokestacks, it's actually quite difficult to estimate or let alone measure emissions from our food system. But we're sort of trying all sorts of bookkeeping techniques to make better estimates of that, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But the emissions from our food system and associated land use change are, of course, pumping the climate change that's happening right now, right? This is, depending on how you add it up, a quarter to a third of annual emissions comes from food and land use, associated land use change. And of course, we're sitting in the middle of an amped up hydrological system pounding the West Coast right now as just one manifestation of that intensified dynamics from warming. And then in turn, the second bin we're thinking about is how does the climate then, our atmospheric changes, how do they impact the way in which we're able to grow food? So everything from directly impacting crop production to how farmers, are thinking about what they grow and where they grow it, and adaptations in that system. And this is important because then when we do think about how farmers and systems are responding to those changes, that closes that loop, right? And the decisions we make result in the next set of emissions into the atmosphere. And so this is a coupled system. And for the engineers and physical scientists in the room, right? Anytime you think of a coupled system, right, there's a possibility of amplifying or feedback cycle that maybe the social scientists or humanities scholars would think about as a vicious cycle, right? Something that reinforces and runs away, where we have sort of decreasing food security and amplified climate change. And what we really want to know is there a good equilibrium in this, right? Is there a set of maybe farmer and system adaptations or interventions that reduce emissions and that result in a more robust food system? So that's how we're thinking about this. And so I'll say, as Peter alluded to, when you think about a coupled system, you can think you can be a despairing person and say, whoa, there's a lot of potential for a vicious cycle. And I would say there's some evidence that we're in a little bit of a vicious cycle right now. But you can also think of it from an optimist's point of view, that to say that there are a lot of leverage points in this system to think about looking for that stable equilibrium. And I count myself in that second bin. I'm a little bit of a puppy dog personality innately anyway, but I also think that the science has taught us a lot about optimistic ways forward. And I hope to convey not just the despair, but the optimism today. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, especially since we have a big interdisciplinary group, is of course that the world food economy isn't just a big pile of food, and we don't just kind of need to think about it as like a distribution system where we just have to have like political will to like move food around in the right way. Right? That's not That's not how the food economy works. And in fact, the centralized food distribution systems historically in the world have been unmitigated disasters, right? So we need to think about this really from a complex system perspective, not a kind of like engineering optimization perspective. And that's one of my favorite parts about being here at GPS, is that we've got folks thinking about this in the way that leads to real solutions. But let's talk about what the world food economy really does look like. All right. So when we look out at the world, our food is produced by hundreds of millions of farmers, right? So I'll come to this in a minute. It's about 600 million farmers. All of us are consumers. So newly about 8 billion consumers. And when we look at who's in between the producers and the consumers, it's on the order of tens of millions of intermediaries globally. Right. So this is by definition a complex system, and probably the one system that it involves everyone on the planet. So it doesn't get more complex than this. And each year in that system, each production cycle in that system, right, the producers are looking out at the world and making their decisions about what to grow based on economic signals, based on different types of security. Are they able to plant what they want? Is their situation stable? And cultural values about preferences. And they're also looking at environmental expectations. And one thing we've learned ever more robustly in the past 10 to 15 years is just how coherent the emerging climate signal is. This is a little figure from the most recent IPCC. The 6th assessment report is just coming out now. And the chapter on food security sort of categorized this nice set of kind of cascading climate risks to food security, not just through production, but also, of course, through prices and through different pathways. So we've got a very complicated system with shifting signals that producers are working on. And so it's not a distribution optimization problem. It's actually a complex system. So let's come back to these farmers. We got about 600 million farmers. And of them, about 500 million of them are considered family farms in whatever their national categorization would be. So that looks different. For example, the farm size for a family farm in Brazil is different than it is in China. But according to domestic categorization, most of these are family farms, not big agribusinesses. And that percentage breakdown may be surprising to some. The other thing to know is that most of those family farms are pretty small, right? To be defined as a family farm, you're typically not an enormous farm. And sort of contrary to maybe our perception in a very blessed way here in Southern California, most food really is local. Most food is consumed fairly close to where it was produced. And especially when we think about international trade, the global markets tend to be thinner in food products than most might think. The other thing to know is that most of the world's farmers are nevertheless net consumers of food as opposed to net producers. And so a kind of corollary to that is that a lot of them, the majority of the world's smallholder farmers, are in fact food insecure, meaning that they are lacking physical or economic access to the types of food they want in a temporally stable way for the life that they want to live. So it looks different in different places, but what I want to leave you with is that we have a world right now where 1 billion people almost go to bed hungry every night. That's a reversal after decades of progress. The past few years have seen a reversal in that trend. And the heart of that problem is on the world's smallholder farms. Not uniquely, but there. There's obviously also food insecurity in urban scenarios as well. But I want us to think about farmland, because when we're thinking about leverage points in this system, I want to start from the fact that there's a lot of land pressure here, right? If we're not able to make enough food, even for the people who are producing on the world's smallholder farms, if they're not able to make enough food for themselves, either directly or through, mediated through markets, there's a lot of land pressure to expand the footprint of production. And that really brings us into the crux of the climate and food problem. Okay, so that's my backdrop. And now I want to tell you a little bit about the research that we're doing. Again, I'm going to start over on this left side and talk about what we've learned about emissions from agriculture and land use change. And then I'll move my way a little bit around this sort of system doodle and tell you a little bit about what we've learned, and then hopefully that can tee up our discussion. Okay, so when we think about emissions from food and agriculture and associated land uses, it had historically been quite hard to know what was emitted where, through what process, et cetera. And so we spent with some colleagues a lot of time over the last few years building up a global emissions inventory and emissions database of where food emissions are happening and through what processes, for what products, et cetera, so that this can be now something that we use to understand, whether we're making any progress. So what I want you to know is that, these are the same data, all of these 4 panels, broken down in different ways. So this black line in each plot is total, what we're going to call land use emissions, sort of food and associated land use change emissions over the past 60 years. And on the left, you have a geographic breakdown by sort of where these emissions are being produced. What processes are contributing to those land use changes. And I want to draw your eye to this. LUC stands for land use change. So what I do want to point out is that the biggest component of agricultural emissions is the conversion of new land into cropland. So when we think about rainforest being converted to pasture or cropland, when we think about expansion into native savanna for more cropland, et cetera, that's this big lower green chunk. Enteric fermentation is the much more palatable name for ruminant belches. So the burps from cows and other ruminants that are predominantly, right, that these are methane emissions into the atmosphere. And then we have some direct emissions from cropland, right? So rice is mostly produced globally in flooded systems, which also results in both methane and nitrogen emissions. And then there's emissions from fertilizer application, from manures and other sources like burning of crop residues. There's some negative emissions in each of these, meaning uptake of carbon through things like abandonment of cropland or growth in forests, things like that. The biggest products that contribute to emissions are cereals. That is not so surprising. It's the basis of our caloric intake as a species. But beef is the biggest one after that. And I know folks have heard about, the single biggest thing you could do to help the climate right now would be to stop eating beef. And this is where these types of statements come from. If we take these data and we look at them in a different way, this is now looking at how much agricultural production per capita is happening on the vertical axis. So think about sort of the calories per person. And then how much emissions, are created per unit of food production. So for 1 million calories, how much are we pumping into the air? And this black line is the global average over time, moving from the right back over to the left. And so we've gotten more emissions efficient over time, and we've produced more per person over time. But I would draw your eye to the fact that globally, we've never produced in any region at a value less than like 0.5 ton per person per year. So we have a pretty persistent emissions footprint from our food system. And we don't know if this is a technological floor or really just going to take a lot more effort with the technologies we sort of understand that we have. But this is there. We need to think about whether we can actually get to zero emissions food systems. Right now, there's evidence that we can get a lot lower, but not to zero yet. All right, so that's the emissions landscape. How are these how are these climate changes driven by anthropogenic emissions? In part ag and land use emissions, but also energy infrastructure, energy industry, transportation, et cetera. How are those affecting our ability to grow food? So this is a brand new hot off the press figure from that new IPCC report. The way that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change works, it's the world's biggest climate science literature review that happens every 4 or 5 years-ish, right? And so they gather all the studies and combine them all either into formal meta-analyses, which are also available in this chapter, but often they also produce kind of qualitative figures for policymakers to just take away. So this is one such qualitative figure, right? So a few hundred statistical studies looking at what productivity has done under changing climate, and what does the ensemble of this scientific enterprise tell us? There's two dimensions here. So the first is the shape of the marker. So a minus sign is negative impacts on crop production. A plus is positive, and a diamond is there's mixed. And then this confidence level, the darker the point is, the more confident we are. So I'll just draw, there's obviously regional heterogeneity. Places with colder crops have benefited, colder crop producing regions, have benefited a little bit from the expansion of their crop growing seasons and crop growing areas. You'll see those plus signs scattered around, or some of the mixed diamonds. But if we look at the bottom, sort of this average of regional data, right, we have these big confident negative signs across the board. And when we think about across regions over on the right, this all crops column, predominantly negative impacts across most of the world. And total factor productivity, right, this idea of how effectively are we able to combine all of our inputs, right, technological inputs, labor inputs, innovation inputs, and turn them into outputs, that has been negatively affected by climate change as well. So a very robust, it's no longer emerging, I would say it's a solidified field of study that the evidence keeps mounting. But in addition to just sort of direct productivity impacts, there's a couple of interesting studies that I thought I'd highlight that our group did in the past year or so. We took a study looking at wheat harvest in the United States and replicated this finding, that we've shown before, and that others have shown before, that increased heat exposure is associated with reduced crop yields. But also that when you think about that in combination with the economic world, right, what prices look like, et cetera, you sometimes get double whammies, if you will. Right, so we see in the US that in anomalously hot years, we have reduced productivity, but then especially in combination with a less favorable price environment, farmers are often opting just to not even harvest in those years. So you can get a double penalty where you have reduced yields, but almost twice as much reduction in overall production because it's just not worth it to harvest. This has been important, especially thinking about Ukraine and what the world wheat situation might look like as this war stretches on and as we get nervous for another cycle of what's going to happen with Black Sea exports and we think about things like U.S. and Canadian wheat being really important on the global market for being able to reduce Russian influence and also serve this global market purpose. So, interesting that this plays out in different ways. The other thing we did recently was show that you often, across the world, when you look at how many cropping seasons people are producing, we don't just see heat leading to reduced productivity, like in a biophysical sense, just reduced yields because of heat pressure. We actually see loss of entire growing seasons. So again, farmers opting not to plant or having catastrophic failure in a way that shows up persistently and globally. So again, thinking about the world food security situation, right? Food is not t-shirts. You can't just like turn up the manufacturing dial to make up for, a loss somewhere or an obvious market hole. It takes time. It takes the right conditions. You got to do it in the right place in the right season. And that's really hard from a food security perspective, especially in a time of political and security instability. One of the other things that we've been looking at over the years is that all the air pollutants that are kind of co-emitted with carbon dioxide and the greenhouse warming gases, these also turn out to be directly damaging to crops. So had one study about 2 years ago that showed across the US over the past 2 decades, when coal plants or coal-fired units have shut down, a very clear signal that crop yields nearby go up. And that's a direct result of the way that gaseous pollutants are directly toxic to plants, as well as particulate matter changes the radiative environment that plants see, right? So it blocks sunlight, it scatters sunlight, and it turns out that these are net negative effects. I'll just show you one other thing. If you look at this black line, let me walk you through this. This middle plot looks just like a boring black line, figure A there. It says distance to the closest facility. So this is what average corn yields look like in the US as you move from zero right around the coal plant itself out to like 50 kilometers away. And you see this depression, these are residuals. So just think about the average compared a comparison to the average for each place here. Yields are lower as you're right next to the plant, and they sort of move up kind of like a donut around the plant. And this is directly in contrast to the pollutant concentrations, coming out from a plant. And I'll say, like, this isn't offset by carbon dioxide fertilization, which would have been nice, but it's not happening. All right, so just briefly, the last bucket that we're looking at is again, sort of how are farmers changing what they do in response to these environmental signals, how are systems changing, and so I'll just say briefly what we're looking at. Among these, smallholder farms, I would say most of them are producing rain-fed crops. So irrigation is pretty low, particularly in terms of smallholder farms. Some smallholder rice systems notwithstanding. And these are seasonal systems because they're rain-fed, they're seasonal, and they're sort of constrained, therefore, by the annual weather cycle, right? So if you have one rainy season, for example, here's a cropping calendar. This is from West Africa. Where you've got in sort of northern, say the southern Sahel region across, southern Sahel kind of band across the region, you've got one rainy season. It sort of starts in June and ends by October, and you're growing then or you're not growing at all. And so what does that do? Already, if you've got a rain-fed system, you're vulnerable on a year-to-year basis, right? If you have a bad year, it can be disastrous. But even in a good year, right, this confinement to the rainy season means that there's a pretty well-documented seasonality to poverty and malnutrition associated with it, right? So right after the harvest, there's more to eat, there's more income, to do all the things, pay school fees, go to the doctor, et cetera. And as those stores are depleted while waiting for the next harvest in this lean or hungry season, you get increased anemia rates, inability to pay for medical care, and the need to, if available, buy food at higher prices. So it's really a rough cycle. And then, if you're in a region where everybody's in these same dynamics, you end up with the possibility of producing kind of local price gluts at harvest time, right? If everybody's desperate to sell, the harvest comes in for everyone at the same time, you're in a bad world where you're, selling low and buying high. And that depresses the ability to make investments in productivity. So this is often called low productivity trap. And so we've been thinking about lots of ways to break out of this, and I'll just highlight my colleagues in case you want to have any of them back. But I have colleagues who are working on, market information, improved seeds, storage and value added activities, right? There's lots of ways you could think about breaking out of this cycle. I'll just highlight a little bit of work we've done on irrigation and water management, because that's one way to break the sort of strict confines of a seasonal precipitation cycle. So a few things that we've done, had a long-running project in West Africa, building and installing and evaluating the impacts of solar irrigation systems. These systems, we showed that they had significant and important impacts on income, nutrition, and women's empowerment, both for users and had some spillover effects for, just having one of these feeding the market that you might be a part of, even if you're not a part of the project. So some pretty compelling evidence for irrigation there. We've done some work in another semi-arid region in Brazil, looking at novel water, livestock feeds and water management systems, including growth of prickly pear as a livestock feed, as a way of sort of storing water in a plant, and being able to help farmers manage seasonal droughts that way through water storage and feed. And that's had some really exciting impacts. And then also thinking about like designing water markets in places like California, where we, are always getting too much rain in some places and not enough in others. What could you do there? So just a little bit to tee up our discussion. I'll say we're also doing some work using cool remote sensing data to think about how to do irrigation sustainably. So using surface mounted GPS systems and satellite radar to measure how the ground is moving and infer water storage from there. Work with a bunch of colleagues at Scripps, and thinking how we might help use and build these kinds of tools for sustainable groundwater management. I'll pause there because I think it's time for discussion, and I'll just say thank you. And this is how you can contact me. Thanks for letting me yammer away for half an hour.
Well, Jen, thanks very much. That was really great. And as I say, I think the best way for you all to do this is to use the question command, and I will try to follow that. And so to give you time for it, I will use the speaker's prerogative to ask the first question so that you can all think of what your questions are and raise your hand. The question I was thinking of, Jen, is I wonder if you could talk about the variable of what is the role of policy in creating structures that get food to different kinds of people. I was thinking of in some of the famous famines, the Irish potato famine, or the controversy over the corn laws in Britain in the 1840s, and the India famine. The argument has often been that for some of the later famines, it wasn't a shortage of food so much as the problem, but people who needed it were unable to get it because the markets were set up in such a way that they had no access to getting the food. They didn't have the income, or the distribution systems were not set up in a way that they could have it. So I was wondering how that enters into the kind of calculations that you're doing, which I heard you emphasizing. How do we improve productivity and how do we reduce waste? And I was wondering how you would factor into this the calculations that would affect distribution.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So, I think Amartya Sen probably colored how all of us think by saying that all famines are political, and particularly drawing out the cases of India, right, where it really was a reality that food was rotting in certain corners, and it was all about, lacking the entitlement, the inability to access even economically what was already there. What I do think is the case is that that's still a reality, but I think the view, perhaps like in the late 1990s, that there was no such thing as a food availability famine, a food availability shortage type famine. I think we're reversing course on that. Right now, the probability of like joint climate shocks to the world's bread baskets has opened that again. And you raise a really important point, Peter, about like what kind of institutions do we need? Because simultaneous with the sort of entitlements framework view of famines was this idea, of course, that like direct food aid is not necessary if that's the case, right? You don't want to mess with markets. You want to facilitate markets. You don't want to mess with local production. You want to pump money in if people need money to access food. And one of the things I think we all saw, which is not a climate shock, but with Ukraine, right, with the countries that were going to be most immediately dependent on that wheat in the following months, was that money only went so far if food prices quadrupled. So there was a real need for physical food, for imports to make up for that on short time scale. So I don't have a direct answer for what the right institutional design is, but I would say we're starting to think about like what is a new international order that maintains some sort of food stores now to deal with the possibility of joint climate shocks to major producing regions, or joint, environment and political shocks to regions. So great question.
Good. So I have Christine Hunefeld, and then I have Barbara Parker as questions to ask. Christine, your turn.
Yes, thank you so much, Jan, for such a most important research that you are doing. Thank you so much. I have been working for decades in the Andes and the Amazon basin, and I have a two-sided question. The first one is, what are your sources? I mean, I have found that all the statistical sources that I get, aside from the scientific ones that you are using, are rotten in the first place. No? So there's a lot of illegal hoarding, illegal contraband, you name it. No? And the other question has to do with the rescue of traditional techniques. I mean, I'm thinking ecological niches, for instance, in the Andes that were used by the Incas and are currently part of policy making, officially rescuing those techniques. Is there anything comparable? I know about the Himalayas that have a similar ecological environment, but is there any attempt in your research to do this? I mean, rescue risk-averse forms of agriculture. That's what I'm asking. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. I'll do them in reverse order, if that's okay. So regarding rescuing traditional knowledges around this, I think there's a ton of work in that right now, thankfully. Most of my work directly in the field has happened in either West Africa or Northeast Brazil, and there's sort of different contexts, of course, but in thinking about, there's a very strong, like if we think about the extension system that exists in West Africa, there's kind of a very strong integration of sort of traditional understandings of crop rotation systems and preferences and pollinator management and things like that woven in with more modern extensions. So it's been really interesting to see that. And I think one of the things we see is the smaller the land holdings, this is a pretty robust finding, the more diverse the production and the more sort of ecologically integrated, because it is a very natural insurance scheme and risk spreading system. So there's been a lot of work in that context to scale it up. In Brazil, it's been a much more in the sort of semi-arid region, like rediscovery of some of these techniques, if you will, right? Sort of reintroducing to farmers through extension and training some of these types of systems for soil water management and integrated cropping and whatnot. So I think the movement has been tremendous in that way recently. Your first question, data, they suck. Yeah, it's true. So all sorts of great work detecting baloney national accounts data. So I think you have a really good point there. The beautiful thing about satellites in the past 2 decades, in terms of a really rich satellite record, but really thinking about the Landsat era, stretching back to the 70s, in terms of sort of robust views on this, is that for things like land clearing, now we have a pretty objective view. Brazil has been so amazing in terms of using remotely sensed information to actually think about compliance with the forestry code. So I think it's been a cool world in terms of new data capacity. Still, you're right. When we do ground checks of this, like how well do farmers estimate their own yield? Pretty badly. They estimate their production pretty well, but production per unit area, they're pretty bad on knowing what the actual area they planted was. They maybe know what the size of their land holding is well, but they've cut off a corner or bled into some other territory. So that we do have to get better at doing, but we think we know production in a better sense now, especially constrained by satellite observations and land use change through these new remotely sensed approaches.
Great, thank you. Barbara Parker. You're muted. You're muted, Barbara. Barbara, you're muted.
Yep, got it. Thank you, Jen, for a very provocative discussion. I wanted to kind of ask your opinion regarding food insecurity in the United States. Rana Foroohar, in her recent book, Homecoming, has several chapters on agribusiness, disruption of supply chains during COVID, and policy decisions made by multiple administrations over the past 50 years, which have led to current political and policy-based food insecurity in the United States. And I was wondering if you had thoughts or if this was an area of interest as well to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I have my grab bag. Like if I had executive authority for a day, what would I do? And I think so. First, let me just corroborate, right? Like, especially we look just here in California, 1 in 5 kids is food insecure, and those are predominantly urban kiddos, right? Without economic access. There's and the role that our school lunches and school breakfasts and school dinners now in California, right, play is shocking, I think, for those who haven't been involved, sort of haven't seen how many kids are picking up take-home dinner at the school gate right now every day. So you're absolutely right. Policies, I would say we've had some really bad policy decisions linked to climate in a couple of different ways over the past, say, in addition to sort of historic agribusiness subsidy, even in the past few iterations of the Farm Bill, we've moved really away from direct support for farmers entirely. Now what we do is help them buy insurance, and that makes sense in a climate sense, right? The private sector is not going to take on the correlated risk associated with food production. So I think we've moved into a policy support structure for farmers in the US that makes a lot more sense than the direct support that led to dumping on world markets and battle in Seattle and all of this. So I think we're moving in the right direction. What are some other things that are going to help? No longer having Iowa be the first caucuses. That's been on my list for a while. I'm so glad that that's changing. I wish we could unwind the ethanol mandate. That's another thing distorting markets in the US. and that's a hard one to unwind. But that's another thing contributing to sort of a demand pipeline that isn't actually meeting food security needs either domestically or globally.
She makes a couple of comments, and this may be less pertinent to the climate discussion, that the food industry has really been prioritized toward efficiency rather than resilience during the past 40, 50 years. And as a result, we have like 5 major suppliers of milk products in the United States. And the largest pork supplier is Smithfield Farms, which is owned by a Chinese company. And there were all sorts of political ramifications of that during COVID-19. And so do we, as from a governmental perspective, need to think about regulatory or policy structures which help mitigate those types of problematic arrangements?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And dairy's a great example, right? Dairy operations tend to be a little more concentrated. It's a complicated cold storage chain, right? So there are some efficiencies to be had. And dairy also plays a disproportionate role in childhood nutrition. And so there are some real benefits to policy supports that ensure kind of some steadiness and predictability in the dairy market. But how much do we want to do that, and how do we do that in a way that doesn't just cascade into feed markets? I think is really important. So you raise great points.
Thank you.
Julie Fisher, I have next. Julie, don't forget to unmute yourself. Julie, unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Part of it, I came out of landscape architecture with an emphasis in natural resource management and a strong interest in biodiversity protection. One of the things that has frustrated me with most environmental organizations is kind of a political shift since the 70s. There's almost a near refusal to talk about the human overpopulation driving factor, which is really behind all environmental problems and most, human problems. I mean, the lack of resources is not because the planet is a small planet. There's too many people on the planet. And what is making me very irritated is this is not really being taught in schools. We're trying to treat the endless symptoms of human overpopulation, when really the disease is human overpopulation. And it's such a political hot potato, but really we're creating political hot potatoes by not talking about it, because wars are fought over resource depletion and who's going to control those resources. And we have 8 billion people this year, and that's 16 times more people than we had in the mid 1500s. Despite slowing global birth rates since 1968, we're still projected to add 3 billion more humans by the end of the century. That is adding the global population of 1960 to what we already have. Biodiversity is crashing. In 2017, when we had 500 million fewer people, the remaining mammal biomass on the planet was composed 96% of all mammal biomass now is humans, which are 36%, and livestock at 60%. If you take all 6,000 species of wild mammals, ocean and land, that is now only 4% of the total mammal biomass, meaning most wild mammal species are down to 1 or 2% of what their numbers were in the 1800s. And this is going to destroy biotech, which is really critical for both human advancements and just quality of life. So can you address why that topic is being almost ignored in school systems? It's really driving me crazy. I'm 63 years old. I've seen just worse things happening. Wetlands are gone, and climate warming itself. The number 2 reason for that is removal of deforestation and other removal of wild habitats, which sequester carbon. Scientists have said if we just replant forests and restore wild habitats, we could have climate change under control in about 35 years, okay? And yet we're not leaving any space. There is space to do it now, usually overgrazed livestock land and that sort of thing. But we're just ignoring these easier solutions, and we're relying on these really expensive high-tech solutions rather than just, leaving land for nature to sequester carbon. So I'll stop now and let you respond to some of those.
Yeah, no, I think your points are great. We are in the middle of a mass extinction, and you provided really visceral and compelling, numbers for that. So I don't need to go into greater depth. So I think people are talking about population. What I think has fallen out of favor is talking about population from a social engineering kind of standpoint. Like, it was popular among certain crowds half a century ago to talk about forced sterilization as like a policy that was actually on the table here. And the advancement of human rights, I think, has appropriately taken those kinds of ideas off the table. But I do think population's being talked about a lot. Like, I think about my colleagues here who are development economists, right? And they are doing amazing field experiments around women's education and women's empowerment, and how do you help women understand that they have choices, about how they live their lives and what they do. And these are some of the most effective things for, contributing effectively to lower birth rates, right? Like you lift women up and this is what happens. So I think that conversation is just happening indirectly. I would also say there's a bit of a, sometimes people think, oh, we grow more food, that fuels a population bomb. That's definitely not the case, right? It goes the other way. When people have more to eat within a generation, the birth rate falls, right? And so this is like one of the most robust economic findings across space and time. So I think thinking about those most vulnerable populations and focusing resources, on their needs holistically is actually one of the most effective ways to think about stabilizing global population. So I do think that's happening. It's just in maybe in different places than you're thinking.
I agree with you that the eugenics movement was a bad way to go. I guess what I'm saying is that the overpopulation is actually driving, in some sense, more bigotries because of intense resource competition. But I read a Science magazine article that analyzed climate emissions and just on the CO2 footprint. Having one fewer child was 71 times more effective at reducing your carbon footprint than eating vegan your entire life. Okay, so we're focusing on recycling and all these other things, but really the most effective thing is to switch the tax policies away from rewarding high numbers of children and instead flip it to reward small families. We already have a lot of discrimination, but we don't seem to recognize it because all of the policies are actually in favor of having really higher numbers of children with the tax credits that we give, for families that have kids. It's now $3,500 a child. Why aren't we flipping that and rewarding people for having no more than 2 children and rewarding them if they only have 1 kid? I mean, to me, it's family discrimination policies to, basically give tax dollars to incentivize the wrong thing at this time in history,
I think there's zero evidence that the tax credits are incentivizing additional births. I think it's more the idea that conditional on being born, we think public policy should play a role in helping you be able to live a fulfilling and good life. However, the idea that there could be credits for smaller footprints, I think it is a really good one and it's popular. The other thing I'll say is I'm part of a generation and my colleagues younger than me, people are deciding not to have kids for climate reasons. So it's not foreign. Like what you're saying is happening and it's happening widespread. I have a sibling who made that decision. So
just happening way too slowly is what I'm saying. The US population is still rising globally in spite of slower birth rates since 1968. The population is still rising. By the time we get to 11 billion people, a lot of what we're talking about, the biodiversity is going to be gone. So that's all my only comment. I don't think it's happening fast enough. I think there's a reluctance to aggressively talk about it in the way that human civil rights were talked about. I'll let you go forward.
I think the youth are talking about it. They give me hope.
Let's keep moving on. Alan, you had your hand up a little while ago. Did you take it down on purpose?
Julie asked my question in much more detail and eloquence than I could. Thank you.
And Robert, you had your hand up also.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that one of the early voices in favor of policies that would lead to lessening the rise of human population was Roger Revelle in his work in India, pointing out that the education of women on a global basis was one of the best ways to go about reducing the rise in population. But I think we've had enough of the population increase discussion, so I thought I'd lower my hand.
Okay, I mean, I was going to join in that the debate is what policies lead to a change in population dynamic, and I agree with Jen, it's not incentives to have children doesn't have a very big effect. It's what do you do for women in their careers? And in places like Japan and Italy, where there are very high incomes, the women don't want to have children because the men won't help take care of them. And so that's a much more, I mean, it's a much more complicated, what it takes to have people not have children, I think is a rather complicated story. But let's move on. Natasha, are you raising your hand there by raising your hand rather than using the command? Okay,
Yes,
I'll call on you, go ahead.
to do with storage. Do we need to be concerned about the fact that with the supply of the containers that stay in limbo with crops in them, should we be now thinking more often that the crops that can survive these long waits in all the ports should have a priority? Is that an issue we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think especially, the Russian invasion of Ukraine really brought out this question of what does our storage capacity look like globally, and how do we think about a system that has some slack in it, right, to absorb and hold food and not lose it while we figure out how we're going to move it or work out the political arrangements that need to be made or the technological shifts that need to happen to move things around. So I think the short answer to your question is yes. I think this has been a real wake-up call for the idea that coordination around actual food storage, as opposed to maybe, and particularly potentially with a public or internationally managed component, may be really important. And it could just be that, right. So in our strategic reserve in the United States, for example, right, we no longer hold grain in that way. Private sector entities do, but we don't. We can buy it from them if we need. But I think there's a sense that maybe we need to do that more.
So could that be a factor in making decisions what crops? Because we know that we need to keep them in storage longer than we used to. So is that a factor that is going to affect crop yields?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that. There is some crop breeding work looking at sort of better storability, ability to retain nutrition content longer and things like that. But I don't know how much it's affecting choices.
Okay. Thank you.
I saw a program that made very much this point Natasha was making, that all over Africa, there's people developing products for European markets, but that they lack the refrigeration, and they lack the interdependence of all. That's one of your points, really, the interdependence that you need economic growth of various kinds, because you need to develop the electricity to support the refrigeration, to support the crops that you then have to get to market. So you can't just increase crop yield or increase water if you cannot create the systems that then take the productivity and get it to market in some way or another. These things are so deeply interconnected that these are not simply worked out, and these things are so greatly interconnected pieces. So Harry Powell, don't forget unmute yourself. Harry, unmute yourself.
Sorry for holding you up.
No, go ahead.
I have a question about Japanese farmers here in California before 1941 and the internment of Japanese. But apparently the Japanese farmers were so extraordinarily effective that they were producing something like 40% of produce for the state of California. But when they got interned, then they lost their land in many instances, but some survived. And do you have anything to say about, or any comment about the legendary Japanese, and what they did that made them so effective?
With apologies, I don't know enough about the techniques that were used or why they were so much more productive. Just a corollary, I'd say there's been the first turn towards reparation style policy to think about giving land and resources back to folks who either had it or had access taken away, or had land taken away, or were never, had barriers to entry into the market. So I think that's been a positive step forward in national food policy, but I don't know enough about the techniques that were used.
Chino's farm here is one of those examples.
I was thinking about Gino's farm.
Chino's farm is an example because they had land that was taken away from them, and they didn't get it back, but they got some other kind of land. And what they use, he was a pioneer, and what he used is what we would call today French intensive. In other words, it was intercrop planting one crop in the shadow of the other crop, figuring out how you efficiently use the irrigation, which crops support the other crop. He was a pioneer in doing that, which has become spread around the world. And he got to the point where Japanese were sending interns from Japan over to him here, just around the corner, and to learn, the techniques that he was doing here, which were techniques that he had gotten from there, but also he pioneered them. He's one of the developers of these techniques. So, I mean, it wasn't rocket science. He was a pioneer in methods that were being developed in other countries as well at that time. I think that's the answer here. There might be, people more, but that's what he happens to be very close friends of neighbors of mine. And my son happened to work there for a couple summers. And so I learned a lot about it.
Okay, well, I think there was a more hopeful outcome for people of Japanese descent when the University of California decided on a project to make whole the academic records of people who were interned during the war. And I heard some very moving presentations by people who talked about the importance of getting a UC education, but then unfortunately they were interned. And as one of them said, I ran a school in the internment camp, and I was teaching about the Constitution, but outside the classroom, there were people with uniforms and carrying guns. And so I found it very puzzling, but I do believe in the Constitution.
Well, what happened was that Peter Irons, who was in our political science department,
Oh, yes,
was a law expert, and he asked to see, used the Freedom of Information Act to look at the records. And he went and looked at all the records, and he discovered that the government had hidden information and refused to turn it over to the courts. And when he discovered that, he saw that was grounds of a suit. So he went up and down the West Coast, and he tracked down some of the guys who had been interned, and he asked them whether they were willing to file a suit.
Yeah.
And they said yes. And so he used this to file a suit and used it as the basis to get that decision overturned. I think that's the story that you're telling, Harry. I'm not sure. I mean, that was the legal case. Peter Irons was the. I recently went to the Japanese museum. My family here. We went to Los Angeles, and we went to the museum there, and they have a picture of Peter Irons. They talk about him. They honored him for his role in playing that, and so it's a great book. It's quite a fascinating story.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
So I actually have blocked my screen with. Okay, Julie, I'm sorry, it's your hand up.
Okay. This book, The Rise and Fall of, or Fall and Rise of Wetlands in California, you were talking about water management in California earlier. One of the things I think is really being lost on people, because you drive up and down I-99, you'll see endless farmers, clamoring for more dams. I am against more dams. We have more dams in California than any other state. And scientists have said when we're going to have these sudden heavy rainfalls like this year or sudden snow melts, these dams will not be able to hold all that water. California between 1850, this is Central Valley, California, between 1850 and 1930 lost 91% of its wetlands. There used to be wetlands all up and down the Central Valley on both sides, both permanent and vernal pools. That is why the water table in Central Valley was only a few feet below the soil surface. Now it's hundreds of feet down. You know, houses are falling into the ground. We need to be pushing politically for forcing farmers to put wetlands back on their properties and to allow flood overflow rather than, you know, having all these dikes and all this channelization, which really just increases the floods because there isn't enough place for these waters to go. And I think taxpayers need to consider the extreme cost of building dams versus simply restoring what nature already had provided with wetlands. And then you'd also have habitat and trees, and, you know, that would help to reduce climate change. So, I mean, climate warming.
Let's bring back the river. Let's tear the Hetch-Hetchy.
That's right. And, you know, I think the other thing,
Let's save Yosemite Park.
and I think what's weird is when you see the channelization of rivers, and you take a serpentine river that's very long and you straighten it, now that river holds a fraction of the amount of water. So we need to allow these serpentine rivers to come back and restore these areas. In Europe, they are pulling homes back away from rivers. They are trying to restore the riparian zones. You know, the United States has a different political system. I think we need to start having these conversations and be more aggressive about it. You know, slavery didn't end by people being calm and polite. You know, you had to get aggressive to get these policies listened to. You know, we need to get more aggressive, in my opinion, with getting our voices heard on these more progressive, faster solutions that are actually in the long run a lot cheaper.
Okay, I can't quite tell. I see people waving their hands, but I can't quite tell. It's better if you use the raising your hand command, because then I know if you're doing something or not. It's harder to tell if you're, so.
Oh, I apologize. I missed, there were some questions in the chat. Let me just look really quickly. I'm sorry that I wasn't looking at these. So Tom said, related to Peter's first question, how do economic systems affect availability given that the world's wealthy are allowed to capture the food that is available? Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Tom. And really the way in which, in a sort of emergency sense, we have to think about aid, and in a longer run sense, we have to think about policy, right? Which is that the world's poorest populations spend really high fractions of their income or available resources on food, so they can have that be, you know, 70, 80, 90% of their resources are going to food, whether it's what they grow or what they purchase or a combination of the two. So if prices change or availability change, they're sort of effectively excluded from that entitlement. So you're spot on, and I think that's really the guiding thought right now in terms of how we're thinking about aid and longer run policy coordination efforts, kind of in a changing climate.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then Christine said maybe we could also think about the role of genetic engineering and the consequences. Christine, did you want to say more about what you meant? It's a pretty big bucket.
Well, there is a lot of intervention in food production, no? And genetic engineering is just a caption word for it. And I was wondering how that has implications not only on the environment, but also on the way we feed each other, no? And what is going on there in terms of degeneration of ourselves, physically speaking. And there's a lot of corporate money in it as well, no? So it's also a distribution issue. I don't know if you want to comment a little bit on it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the National Academies, I'll just point folks, the National Academies was commissioned to do a report on this a few years ago. And so put together all of the available evidence on sort of GM ecosystem and health literature. So it's 400 thick pages, but it's there, and it's they did a really nice job putting it together. I would say one of the points they make is to think about the different products a little bit independently, right? So I think if unfortunately a lot of things get lumped together under this bin of genetic engineering. So some of it is using genetic techniques like, being able to use the precision afforded by genetics approaches to do what conventional breeding does, right? So to more effectively select out, for example, the markers for stem rust resistance, or wheat number of spikelets or whatever, right? And to then sort of pursue what would otherwise have looked like conventional breeding approaches, but with those tools. And those tend to be a little less controversial because it's kind of just more efficient in terms of resources for doing that. But then there are other types of genetic engineering that are obviously much more what you're talking about, I think. So thinking about things like glyphosate resistance, that's the one that there's a ton of science looking at it right now. It has all sorts of thorny legal and ecosystem and biodiversity issues with which it intersects. It also intersects quite strongly with climate and land use emissions, right? No-till agriculture has been really good for climate, even if it's bad for many of these other dimensions. So I think that's an example of where you'd want to try to think about it holistically. And I'd recommend that National Academy's report as a good place to kind of get the state of the science on all of those. And then finally, I think there's sort of a third category that's been kind of interesting, which is like BT crops. So thinking about splicing in the genetic capacity to produce, something like an insecticide by a plant, and these have, sort of a different set of environmental overlaps and impacts, but also a different, a complicated set of human impacts too. The advent of BT cotton and BT corn resulted in a lot less farm worker illness and farm worker deaths for not having to spray and inhale it. So just a complicated set of issues. And I'll just point you to that resource because I think it's the best compilation recently of all the work there.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah, no problem. I'm not sure where we are at time-wise. I think we're about there, but Julie had made a couple of points. I'm reading them slowly, sorry. If anyone wants to pipe in, please do. Oh, Kirk, sorry, I missed your point in there. Yeah, there's been really interesting work on, man, the ruminant research is amazing. So how do we drive down ruminant methane emissions? So part of it is demand side, right? For those of us with lots of disposable income and lots of food choice, choosing less beef is really great. But also, ruminants are an important food security component for folks with less resources, right? And so we'd never say get rid of all ruminants, but how do we think about maybe ruminants that don't make much methane at all? And there's been amazing research on improved feeds, and these are just kind of crazy experiments. These cows have these like little monitors in their stomachs, and we're like literally measuring how much methane is being produced. It's fantastic. So I'm actually quite optimistic.
I love the idea of giving cows seaweed. That's very appealing to me.
There's something beautiful about it.
I like seaweed salad a lot, so that's very appealing to me to have the cows. Me and the cows joined forces on this. So,
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Erie.
Okay. I had a question about: is it the corn that was fed to cattle? I mean, I grew up in rural Ireland, and so the cattle had plenty of grass and the water fell from the sky, and so there was real abundance. But I can't tell you much about, what I really wanted to inquire here is that when you shift from hay over to corn, Is that what brings on all this extra gas, or what is it?
Feed definitely matters, but they're making it anyway. So the question is, are there ways to think about, they're inherently, they're anaerobic digesters, so they're making methane,
Right.
no matter what it is. The carbon in their food is turning into methane, but it is true that, that's happening in a way that depends on the feed. So there's really, I don't know, just exciting research to see sort of how low it can go.
What about the other species that are damaged by farming? For example, there's been a terrible decline in bird and insect populations. And if you go to southwest France or Ireland or England, you'll see green fields, but above all, hedgerows, loads and loads of hedgerows where enormous numbers of little birds and creatures exist. And taking those away, do you want to comment about that?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of effort to bring that back and to think about integrated sort of pollinator and ecosystem management through things like hedgerows, or analogous systems in other ecosystems.
Harry, but hedgerows also have to do with the patterns of land ownership, because once you have a hedgerow, it's very hard to run tractors over that.
That's right.
So hedgerows imply small landholdings, and that's a very different culture, structure, ownership, all that kind of thing. Julie has had her hand up for a long time. Did you want to say something? Are you being left out?
No, not at all. I was just commenting on one of my favorite topics is native plants. They help to restore native pollinators, including native bees. Honeybees are an introduced species. They don't appear to be essential for pollinating crops. There have been studies through the UC system that if you just replant native plants, you can get all the pollination that you need for farm crops. So we need to also be pushing farmers to, some of them are doing it, but it's a very tiny percentage of small farmers doing it. We need to actually incentivize replanting a large amount of native habitat so that these pollinators can, come back in and help do the crop pollination. That's really scaring me a lot, is because a lot of these pollinators are some of them are unique to certain species of plants. And so if you don't have those pollinators, eventually you won't have those plants either. So that's another comment I wanted to make. And biodiversity loss, I think people are not also paying attention to, as food production is being pushed to high yield species, we're losing biodiversity both in crops and in farm animals around the world. And so that's actually, in my opinion, a bad thing, because a lot of these animals and crops were adapted to the local climate and environmental conditions in those areas. And if we just focus on high yield and become very dependent on sustaining those kind of crops or those kind of animals in an environment where they're not really adapted, I think we're getting to another high cost, high tech solution, which I think sometimes backfires on us routinely.
Right. Well, you all be happy to know I read in today's New York Times, I think, that buffalo do a better job on the soil of the Midwest than cattle do. So they've compared fields that were left to one or the other, and the fields over which the buffalo roam are in better shape than the fields over which the cows dwell. So on that note, I think we have reached 5, and I want to give a very big thanks to Jen. Thank you very much. This is very stimulating, very interesting, and I feel more optimistic than I started out. I didn't want to leave the sense that I was a pessimist. I think that it's like a lot of these topics, there are good and bad things out there, and thank you for doing your work that you do, and thank you for an interesting and stimulating presentation for all of us. Thanks a lot, Jen.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful
Great job,
evening.
Jen. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, and see you next month. It's about AI and other stimulating things by Christensen. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.